Is it time, Will?
It is time. Let's go.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to New Hampshire Peace Actions Peace and Justice Conversation Series online. We're glad to have you. My name's Amy Antonucci. I'm on the board. And just going to give a little bit of introduction here before we get into it. So New Hampshire Peace Action educates, mobilizes, and organizes to build a more peaceful and just future for all. We envision a future where international relations are based on cooperation instead of competition and conflict, and where mutual benefit and shared security lead to a more peaceful and just global community. In that spirit of respect, we'd like to take a moment now to acknowledge that we are doing our work here in New Hampshire on the traditional ancestral homelands of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land and the waterways and the people that have been stewarding them throughout the generations. And thanks to Indigenous New Hampshire for that map. Quick word on Zoom etiquette. We love it when you keep your video on, but we do ask that you keep your audio muted when you're not the one talking, and feel free to start using the chat to, get your questions out there. I expect later we'll probably have a little more ability to call on people because we're going to have a small group, but for now, just let's start with chat. This every other week online series has been a way for us to engage, to learn, and figure out how to get closer to the changes we've been yearning for. It was started by the upheavals of 2020, but we plan to keep it going well into the future as long as we can. So tonight's topic, our speaker, Stephanie Savelle, unfortunately could not come due to an illness in the family, but the issue of costs of war and military spending in this country is a huge topic that we definitely want to talk about continually and bring back. So we'll have her another time, but we have enough expertise in the group that we wanted to have the conversation anyway. And of course, in April, tax season, it is a moment that we do like to stop and pause and think about where our resources are going in this country. So what we're going to do is hear tonight from Will Hopkins and Chris Marion, and then again move into a conversation. Will is going to get us started. Am I right?
You are.
All right, so I'm going to pass it over to Will.
All right, folks. Thanks for coming on tonight, and I will try not to take offense if some of you jump ship, seeing as I'm not Stephanie Savelle. So I did want to talk about what we actually were planning on talking about today, which is the cost of the war. The Cost of War project at the Watson Institute at Brown University has been researching the different ways that our responses to 9/11 have affected our society over the last 20, now almost 21 years. In their latest estimate, which was published in September of 2021, they were able to directly attribute a little over $8 trillion, it's trillion with a T, dollars to the wars that we have fought in the Middle East in response to 9/11. It's a bit of a conservative estimate because there are some things that are really hard to measure. And their research also isn't just on financial costs. It breaks it into three categories: financial, human, and social and political. And I'll talk a little bit about the human and social political costs, but I'm going to focus a lot during my part before I turn it over to Chris on the financial costs of these wars. So how did they get to $8 trillion for these wars? They attributed direct appropriations, the Overseas Contingency Operations Budget, sometimes called the Pentagon Slush Fund. It's an additional expenditure that was instituted and it was stopped for a while during the Obama administration. I'm not sure if it's currently active or not, but it's extra money directly to fund counterterrorism around the world. They also attribute the Pentagon base budget items that are directly attributable to the war. So things like the number of soldiers who would otherwise be stateside, but they're fighting in combat. That's a cost of war. The equipment that is in the base budget that is being sent over is included as a cost of war. They also include the healthcare costs for veterans of those wars that are those people, folks like me. I get all my healthcare through the VA hospital, and that's because I'm an Iraq war vet. That's a cost of the war. You have to pay for my healthcare through the government because I went to Iraq. Veterans' disability from the wars, interest on war borrowing, attributable homeland security costs. So they tie in any costs that are directly tied to counterterrorism in the homeland security budget. And then reconstruction costs paid because of the damage we've done overseas. So those all added up over the last 20 years come to about 8 trillion. There are a lot of financial costs of war that aren't included in the Watson Institute's research on the cost of wars. And that's things like lost income for caretakers of disabled veterans. So a lot of folks come back, say they're paraplegic or they don't have legs, or they're blind, and they need help to survive. Frequently, it's family members who wind up doing that, and those people are taken out of the workforce. Those are costs that are really hard to measure and that don't get included in those estimates. The other thing that they haven't included is future costs, which we can expect to be a lot more than what we've paid. When you look at the costs of previous wars, the cost of the Korean War per year has just started. We're about 5 years ago, it began to come down, and that's because healthcare costs of veterans go up as they get older. So the Korean War reached its most expensive point about 7 years ago. The Vietnam War still hasn't reached its most expensive phase. And so we'll be paying on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan for, well, as long as I'm alive, at least. So that's something that you can't measure, but we know it's coming, that these, we haven't finished paying for the wars that we fought over the last 20 years. And then you also can't measure lost opportunity costs. So things that we could have spent that money on: education, roads, bridges, public transportation, all of the things that we decided to go without that could have been major benefits to our economy are now, they're unmeasurable because we don't know how much could have been done and what the effect of that would have been. But we can estimate some of it. So what could we have done with $8 trillion? So the UN estimates that 45 billion per year would end malnutrition and starvation globally. So easily under that budget, we could have ended starvation and hunger globally. We could have probably, or at least very close, moved the entire US energy grid to renewables. The estimated cost for that is between 7.8 and 13.9 trillion to move our entire energy grid off of fossil fuels and nuclear energy to renewables. About 1 trillion, so 1/8 of that, would give us coast to coast high speed rail. And we all know we can imagine what sorts of public work projects and the scale of public work projects that $8 trillion could do as far as infrastructure. As far as, there's an argument. So Arnie, who's on the call today, in a meeting once used the term military Keynesianism to describe the way our government functions. We have Pentagon contractors who make lots of jobs and have lots of well-paid lobbyists, and max out their campaign contributions. And in turn, we have a political system that's very friendly to spending money as long as it is making weapons that produce death all over the world. The thing about military Keynesianism is that it's extremely inefficient. So healthcare and education, you can make at least twice as many jobs per dollar, or per $1 billion, or however you want to measure. It's a little more than twice as many jobs in healthcare or education, and it's at least 1.5 times in infrastructure or clean energy jobs. So we actually lose a lot of jobs by choosing military Keynesianism if we're going to do Keynesianism, and that's been pretty well and thoroughly researched. It's actually research that the Watson Institute is doing and has done. You also have the consideration of the economic benefits of those sorts of things. When you educate people, they then are able to provide more of a benefit to society. You have more doctors, you have more teachers versus unskilled labor. Not that there's anything wrong with unskilled labor, but that's an increased benefit to the society. When you build a bridge, you then have the trade that moves across that bridge. When you build a bomb, it explodes, somebody dies, nobody benefits. The economy doesn't grow. There's no larger benefit to society, and that has an economic cost as well. And again, it's really hard to measure these things, but as we look at that $8 trillion figure, it's an important thing to think about. And I'm in particular, I think about things like feeding the hungry, which on a national level is a pittance compared to what we've spent killing people overseas. Think about the reality that we have hundreds of red line bridges in New Hampshire. The housing crisis in New Hampshire is absolutely devastating and could be, if these funds were spent more responsibly, we could be in a different situation. So I frequently, when I think about Pentagon spending, and in particular the spending on these wars, the saying that comes to my mind is, this is why we can't have nice things. So that covers what I want to talk about as far as the financial costs. It's been a 20 years of what I see as a policy of vengeance, not something that it didn't solve anything. It didn't fix anything. It was the choice that we made as a society, that most of the people on this call, obviously we didn't make that choice, but that was made as a society. And it was, financially, it was really a devastating decision. But beyond that, there's the human cost, which is something that, for me, I can talk about dollars and not feel anything. It's hard to talk about the human costs because I remember what those, I know what it looks like. I know what the other side of that is. The estimates that the Watson Institute has put together for deaths is about 900, and they use confirmed deaths. If they can't confirm it and find out who it was, they don't count it. But they have 929,000 confirmed deaths due to U.S. warmaking since 9/11. Of those, about half are civilians. About a third are enemy combatants, which in my mind are the people who I was fighting against, who were defending their homes. So we talk about them as the enemy, but these were people who were like the people defending Mariupol in Ukraine, or like people would defend the US if we were invaded. These were people defending their homeland from foreign invaders, who were there every bit as illegally as The Russians are now in Ukraine. You can't invade a foreign country that hasn't attacked you, and Iraq and Afghanistan did not attack us. So those were people defending their own countries. About 75,000 deaths are US allied local forces. So police forces that were paying, militias that were paying, the recognized government that I was working with in Iraq. And then finally, about 8 to 10,000 of those deaths are US contractors. And I do want to talk a little bit about contractors. It's a number that most people don't understand what military contractors means. And they assume if we have 10,000 military contractors dead, that those are mostly Blackwater soldiers who are out on the streets. So there is a very small number of military contractors who are carrying weapons. Most military contractors in combat zones, and a general rule of thumb in modern warfare is that the US has twice as many contractors on the ground as we have soldiers. So every time you hear if there were 60,000 combat troops in Afghanistan, there were 120,000 contractors. Most of those are third country nationals. So Pakistanis, Saudis, a lot of Filipinos, and most of them are doing things like building bases, filling sandbags to go around generators, which are extremely loud. So they build walls of sandbags around the generators. That is how they power all the bases, running the dining halls, doing the laundry, cleaning the bathrooms. Combat soldiers, the military, at least when I was in, still had things like cooks and postal workers, but generally they would serve in a command function. So you'd have a soldier who was in charge of the dining facility, but the cooks and the dishwashers and everybody working there would be a Filipino who was being supervised by them. So most of those 8 to 10,000 contractors aren't Blackwater soldiers. They're civilians from the Philippines or Indonesia or Saudi Arabia who are there trying to send money home to their families. And finally, the last 7,000 or so of that 929,000 deaths are US troops. More than 100,000, although the numbers are quite intentionally not tracked very carefully, but more than 100,000 veterans of those wars have committed suicide since the wars. Again, those numbers are very hard to track, and it's also hard to attribute them directly to the war. What we know is that veterans commit suicide at a rate of about twice the general population. Female veterans are about 5 times more likely than non-veteran women to commit suicide. And as a veteran, I think about those suicides as a result of moral injury, which is, it's very tangled up with PTSD. This idea that you've done something wrong and it's left you irredeemable, and you've done violence. And moral injury is it's different than just having been through trauma. It's having inflicted trauma and knowing that you were wrong. So beyond that, US wars and militarism in the Middle East have created more than 38 million refugees. So for scope, if you take all of the refugees in the 20th century, excluding those created by World War II, so World War I and all of the other conflicts that happened in the 20th century, it does not add up together to be as many as the US has created since 9/11 as a result of our war making. You also have conditions on the ground when you look at Iraq and the for a long time growing influence of the Islamic State. That was definitely part of a reaction to US invasion there. Libya, which I include under these wars, and as does the Watson Institute, which when Gaddafi was in power, and I am not a supporter of Gaddafi, but Libya had the lowest infant mortality, the highest level of education and literacy rate, the highest average life expectancy, and it has become the slave trading capital of the world now, and no longer on the African continent, it had the highest literacy and lowest infant mortality, et cetera. It no longer is anywhere near the top of that list, and has become the slaving capital of the world since our action there. So that's a little bit of the human cost. And again, that's something that I feel quite personally, and I think of those civilian deaths in particular as even if the wars had made this country wealthy and had not cost us what they have, the children who were killed, it doesn't, it's not, there's no parity with what happened on 9/11. Hundreds of thousands. And then finally, the Watson Institute investigates the social costs. So how has it changed our lives here in the US? And primarily their focus is on the widespread surveillance that has had a major uptick since 9/11, the militarization of police. One of the most interesting things that the Watson Institute has researched at Cost of War is the transfers of military equipment to US police departments. That's increased by a factor of 50. So more than 50 times as much military equipment is going to police forces than before 9/11. So 5,000% increase in the transfer of military equipment to local law enforcement. And finally, they've done some research about the harassment of Muslim communities by law enforcement, which is pretty widespread. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris there. We're sorry Stephanie couldn't be here today. I'm sure she would have laid this out a lot better than you are, but we did want to make sure we had some space to have a conversation about the work the Watson Institute has done on the costs of war. So Chris, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Will. Yeah, and actually, so just wanted to say that I really appreciate you going over all of the various costs that were covered as part of this study. I'm going to diverge just a little bit from the originally intended topic and talk about the cost of the U.S.'s expansionary policies as a result of its immense military footprint, as well as some of the social, political, and economic costs of what is often referred to as asymmetric warfare, or legal warfare, economic warfare waged against various countries. So yeah, just to dive in, war is often described, or at least most often described and discussed, as like direct military conflict between two armed forces. You see these kinds of conflagrations in movies all the time, so like scenes of pitched battles of antiquity, or in more modern context, trench warfare and World War I and World War II. But what's often what's less often discussed is really the underlying motives behind these conflicts, what is driving them, and really being the control of resources, the control of military or of political power, and really just expansion of control, whether it be into whatever sphere it may be into. Sphere of influence, it is being the most typically applied term. And I just wanted to read a quote from a speech given by General Smedley Butler. I believe this particular one was given in 1934. And it just says, "War is a racket. It always has been, and it is possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable, and surely the most vicious. It is the only one international in scope, and is the only one in which profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. A racket is best described, I believe, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of people. It is only a small inside group that knows what it's about. It is conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the very many. Out of war, a few people make huge fortunes. In the World War, a mere handful garnered profits from the conflict. At least 21,000 new millionaires and billionaires were made out of the United States during the World War. That many admitted their huge blood gains in the income tax returns. How many of their war millionaires falsified their income tax returns? No one knows. So just to kind of encapsulate like what is often the coming of war, what is driving of war, and that is really just the making of money and the control of resources, the control of or the political influence. And I wanted to dive into a couple different aspects of this, the ways that this kind of has played out, and that is sanctions and coups across the globe. Coups that the U.S. has either funded or been directly involved in the sense of like a direct military invasion. I wanted to start with the Berlin Conference of 1884, which kind of sparked off the most recent kind of iteration of this, of what we've seen as warfare. So in 1884, leaders of 14 European countries and the United States came together to discuss control over Africa's resources. Came to be known as the Berlin Conference, and they sought to discuss the partitioning of Africa, establishing rules to amicably divide resources amongst the Western countries at the expense of the African people. The biggest countries that were there were Germany, France, Great Britain, Portugal, and the United States. And within about 10 years, the African continent had been entirely, all the governments of the various countries within in Africa had been overthrown, with the exception of one or two whose names are going to escape me at the moment. And what were these countries after? They were after tin, oil, palm oil, various other minerals. So just to kind of, once again, lay out what it is that is driving these wars. And, with that, kind of wanted to move into the modern way that this has played out. And that has really been the rise of the use of sanctions, specifically by the United States. And it's referred to in the activist community as really modern day siege warfare. So kind of refer back to my intro, historically warfare, and specifically siege warfare, has been fought against enemies that were in walled cities. Tactics that were used include the burning of crops, salting of lands, destruction of shipping lines, really with the goal of destabilizing the population and really political structure within that city or typically the capital, with the hopes of those people rising up, overthrowing that leadership, and really accepting the outsiders to come in. It's like, okay, we give up, you can come in and do what you want. And that mentality has been brought in and manifested in modern day U.S. sanctions. And to give just an example of how expansive this practice has become, currently about 1/3 of the global population lives under some form of U.S. sanctions. And just a couple of the biggest examples of that have come to light really in the last 10 years are Venezuela. And to speak of the human cost, because of U.S. sanctions, the Venezuelan government can't import food, they can't import medicine, they have difficulty importing medical equipment, and that's led to tens of thousands of deaths in the last 10 years. There was a study that was released recently by the Economic Sanctions a study called "The Economic Sanctions as Collective Punishment," and it said that as many as 40,000 people have died in Venezuela as a result of U.S. sanctions that made it harder for ordinary citizens to access food, medicine, and medical equipment. Another example is the U.S. trade embargo against Cuba, which has cost the government and the country almost $150 billion in the last 60 years. Third example that I use tonight is the example of Iraq, and this is really in the 80s and 90s, but U.S. sanctions against that country as a means of trying to overthrow Saddam Hussein killed almost 500,000 children. Children were dying at the rate of about 10,000 a month. So there's just another example of the ways that don't involve a direct military intervention, but are still, in many cases, more deadly, but still are driving at that same goal. And the last topic that I'll touch on is coups. Once again, discussing the driving forces being really control of resources. The first CIA coup operation after World War II was in 1953 against Mohammad Mossadegh, the democratically elected leader of Iran. And the reasoning behind the operation was that Mossadegh had nationalized Iran's oil supply and kicked out the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. So in a coup that brought the Shah to power, extremely violent dictator, that's what the U.S. was after. And very soon after the success of this operation, the Iran's oil supply was thoroughly privatized, allowing multinational corporations to come in and gobble up the oil at a significantly reduced price. Another example is that of Chile in 1973, what's referred to as the first 9/11, with the case of Salvador Allende coming to power, once again, another democratically elected leader. And the fear was that he would push Chile into socialism. He did refer to himself as a socialist, and was eyeing nationalization of resources. And this is another instance of the use of sanctions. And sorry, I'm just looking at my notes here. Richard Helms, the then director of the CIA, referred to the use of sanctions as making the economy scream. So once again, it's kind of highlighting that the use of sanctions as siege warfare. And the last thing that I'll touch on, I know we're getting past the half-hour point that we wanted to stay within, but is really the environmental costs of the U.S.'s or the U.S. military's military footprint and operations throughout the globe. The U.S. military is the largest single consumer of fossil fuels on the planet, and is the largest single producer of CO2 emissions. There are about 196 countries, I believe, that are members of the UN. And if the U.S. military was a country, it would come in 55th. It has about 800 military bases in 800 military bases in over 100 countries. And so, just speaking of, or back to the history of the U.S.'s involvement, and whether it be direct military interventions or coups, they're just discussing the vast imprint that the U.S. military's influence has and how that can play on the political sphere. And to just kind of bring it back and wrap it up into domestic politics, speaking about the environmental cost and really the use of unregulated chemicals that are known to cause cancer, the unregulated dumping of those chemicals, of equipment, of rocket fuels, that kind of thing, into the ground. Military bases all over the country are actually now designated by the EPA as Superfund sites. Sites considered just so toxic that the areas surrounding them are completely uninhabitable. And there are ones in North Carolina, Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio are just a couple of examples. And many of these Superfund sites, whether they do surround military bases or were served as military base dumping grounds, sit on indigenous land, and has been the source of fierce ongoing struggles by indigenous communities to rectify that and get those sites cleaned up. So I'll end it there and turn it back over to Will. Sorry, I hope that was concise enough and really stuck with the topics. So, thank you.
Amy?
Yeah, well, that was great. Thank you, Will and Chris. And questions have started to arise. So I'm going to take them from the chat first, and folks can keep putting questions there. Also, like I said, if you'd really rather just ask it, I think we do have time for that. So you can, use the little hand raise thing there to get in line for that. But first, all right. So I think that, well, I'll put out the question. I think this is mostly to Chris, but Michael was wondering, is the democracy promotion industry part of this sort of military strategy like you were discussing sanctions?
Yeah, absolutely. The idea of the U.S. being the shining city on a hill, and the Western form of democracy, and really being the promotion of market-based economies, privatized economies. The idea of promoting democracy really serves into that type of expansion, and has really become a cottage industry into itself. So, I mean, think tanks, and think tanks and the communications firms, have cropped up really to figure out how to promote the idea that not only is the U.S. like the shining beacon of democracy, but what exactly democracy is and how to sell it to the rest of the world.
Thanks, Chris. And I think this one is sort of related. The question is, do you have thoughts on the military use of signature reduction personnel? Can either of you speak to that?
So I clicked on the link, Michael, and it's kind of a new topic for me, and unfortunately, no one person can understand it all. I'd actually love it, Michael, if you'd be willing to unmute and talk a little bit about what it says in that article. I obviously didn't have time to read it while Chris was talking, but when you sent it, I clicked, and it looks like it's mostly covert contractors that it's referring to. It's a Newsweek article.
Yeah, from a year ago. So I've been asking different people for the last year, and no one seems to have resonated with what William Arkin has written. And I'm not sure the accuracy, but he reported he's written many books on the topic. He used to work for NBC. I mean, that's what he does, has what he called strong relationships with people in that industry. And what he said was about half the people involved are cyber, and the other half are personnel. So apparently what signature reduction is it's done by contractors that kind of hide people's identities. So for example, if American soldiers want to pretend that they're Russian so that they can aggravate and create these false flag operations, or pretend they're Chinese, or pretend they're Iranian, that's what signature reduction does, is helps them appear to be and provide all the documentation so we can say, well, look at what those Iranians are doing, but they're actually Americans doing it, pretending to be Iranians or pretending to be Chinese or pretending to be Russian, is the way I understand it. I mean, I like I say, I would love to really understand it correctly. I don't know that I understand it correctly, but based on what that article and based on all the news clips that came out on various broadcast services, not American, but like in different countries, right after the article came out, that's what they were saying, is that Americans are getting paid to pretend that they're Russians or Chinese so that they can create problems in China or Russia, so then we can say, okay, we can go in and fix it.
Thanks, Michael. Appreciate knowing a little more about it. It's not something I'm familiar with.
I actually did have a little bit of a response. Just to really agree with you, Michael, that is my reading of this as well. And when you started to introduce the topic, what immediately came to mind was the CIA-funded stay-behind armies after World War II. And if you want to learn more about that, you can look up Operation Gladio. It's GLADIO. And basically what they did was, or what the CIA did was they created these little cells that operated mostly in Eastern Europe, and they would commit acts of industrial espionage and that sort of thing, and blame it on the Soviets as a means of kind of provoking the idea of a potential intervention. So it feels like it's kind of stemmed out of that same arc. But yeah, I do agree. That's my reading of this as well.
All right. Well, thanks to all of you for getting into that. We'll maybe be learning more. And there is a hand up. I'm not sure, is Vara? You can start by correcting how I'm pronouncing your name, but please go ahead. And remember to unmute. There you go.
That's correct. It is Isvara. Thank you. I first of all wanted to congratulate everybody. I'm so moved by this magnificently clear. They're jewels of speeches today. They were fantastic and very informative, but this is not being recorded, right? So how can we get copies? Because they were so well organized, and one by one, we tried to spread the word. It's so difficult. And they were so irrefutable, really. I really think that all the points were irrefutable. So my question was that, is there any way of getting copies of these very well organized speeches?
Thank you so much. So Chris and I did put this all together today because Stephanie couldn't make it. This is being recorded. It's being live streamed. And we will send you the YouTube link as a follow-up to this. So you'll have a YouTube that you can share freely around to anybody you'd like. And please do. We want to get it out as far as we can.
I will. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Many of the Monday night programs have been recorded and are up there. We have a whole YouTube channel these days, and there's we have had some amazing folks. So I'm sure Will has I saw he put at least one link in the chat to the one about Cuba, I believe. And once you go there, you can check out all the ones that we've had. So thanks for asking about that, because we definitely need to spread the word beyond each person talking to one person. Yes. So
and what is the YouTube name? Is New Hampshire? What is?
Yeah, it's NH Peace Action. NH Peace Action, and I'll put the link in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, let's see. Other questions? I'm gonna look and see if I missed any. And do feel free to raise your hand to ask. We have plenty of, we have some time. Anyone? Well, I'll ask a very kind of, oh wait. Is there one just come through? Well, I will mention that a number of books have been recommended in the chat. So Ernie and I think someone else have put a few out there. So feel free to save that at the end so that you can follow up on those. I did wonder about the stuff that you were talking about with contractors, Will, which
sure.
I did not realize. And part of what I wondered is why those specific countries. It seems like there's really specific countries that these folks are coming from. Is that?
So I can try to answer it, but I'll warn you, it's mostly speculation. I would say when I was in Iraq, which was 2004, 2005, about 2/3 of the contractors were Filipino. But my experience was that it was places with a lot of poverty where low-paying U.S. job would be enough to, because it was U.S. dollars, enough to send money home. It tended to be the Philippines, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, places where, they were U.S. allies, populations friendly to the U.S., and B, they were not paid well by our standards, but those contractors were paid well enough that they could send money home, and that because it was U.S. dollars, it was worth more. that's all I've got. And again, it's mostly just speculation. Why there were a lot of Kuwaitis, and I don't necessarily know exactly why each country provided folks, but I will say that it was Kellogg Brown and Root was the company that was doing the hiring, so I'm guessing they're conscious about where they're recruiting.
All right, thank you. More hands are going up. Gail is first. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question, Gail. Oh, there you go.
All right. So listening to the discussion made, and I've actually wondered about this before, does anyone know of any instances in which our sanctions have brought about the desired result? I mean, we know the bad results in terms of how it affects children and food supplies and so forth, but has it ever been successful in terms of our desire?
Arnie, can you jump in and give us an answer?
I would say that the sanctions against apartheid in South Africa had some impact on destabilizing or weakening the apartheid system. One of the things about that I think is significant is that the sanctions were called for by people from South Africa. So that's something to look for in terms of whether a sanctions regime could be effective in this case, it might be a matter of, are the people themselves willing to suffer the consequences of the sanctions because they are behind it in order to destabilize an unjust or tyrannical regime.
Thank you for jumping in and rescuing us on that one, Arnie.
Thank you.
I think, Chris, did you want to say something too on that?
I'm actually all set with that, but I did notice Kay Morgan did put a comment in the chat, which I think ties in really, really well. And just to speak to that, the idea of sanctions being preferred to active combat, and just to say that, at least in my estimation, that is really a conscious choice behind the use of sanctions, because when wars tend to go really badly, at least for the U.S., is when pictures of U.S. flags draped over coffins start flooding the airwaves. So if that can be avoided, if all the bleeding can be done on the other side, then it's much easier to carry out that operation. And as far as educating, really just events like this, and also just doing investigation, because a lot of times even the existence of sanctions isn't discussed very widely. So just being able to find those resources and talk with as many people as we can as individuals, and then collectively as groups.
Thanks, Chris. And I will say that we have been on the lookout for someone to do one of these programs on sanctions, because they seem to be well understood and sort of thought of simplistically and clearly. It's a pretty big topic that we could get a lot more understanding on, and that could be helpful. We have another hand up. Is it Mervyn?
Yes, it is. What developments in militarism do you foresee as a result of the present war in Ukraine?
Well, foresight is not a gift I have, but I will say a lot of how we got here is a result of militarism and brinksmanship, because brinksmanship is profitable. We've already seen some pretty substantial arms deals passing through the Senate and House, and weapons being sent to the Ukraine. I imagine that this will, regardless of the direction things go, almost regardless, there are certain directions that would not do this, but almost regardless of the direction things go, it's an excuse to spend more on weapons, which again, we have a system where our House and Senate representatives consider it a win when they can advertise that they made good jobs in their district, keeping America safe. And this is more of a chance to make more weapons and manufacture them and get those jobs home. So it's a the decision by Putin to invade Ukraine makes our job a lot harder.
And as far as like a prediction of how this might affect future military spendings and future military expansion and whatnot, the most apt parallel that I can find that I feel is pretty useful in this context is the funding and the arming and equip operations of the Mujahideen in the 1970s, and just thinking about how the U.S. funding and equipping of that organization turning into Al Qaeda, however many years after the fact, the U.S. just plowing weapons and funding into a country that does have a pretty well documented history of extreme right-wing militias operating within the country. And there was an article that we just came across recently that the U.S. has very few means put in place to track those weapons. So the possibility of those weapons falling into the hands of organizations that, may at the moment be very focused on Russia, but given their sentiments and their political ideology, could very easily turn those weapons towards Europe, which would provide even more justification for more military spending.
So the cycle continues is part of, Mervyn, did that answer?
Yeah, I would assume that one of the results of the present war will be the increased importance of NATO, the expansion of NATO, of bringing highly destructive weapons. Once again, Finland comes in, for example, up to the Russian border. So there's going to be, in fact, a great tension between NATO and Russia, and things on a kind of hairpin alert. I also think, as far as you were saying about groups like Azov, that, of course, one of the reasons why Ukraine was not admitted into NATO was exactly because of those particular groups. So even NATO recognizes that they are a significant threat to stability in that part of the world, and they are. Canada has been training. I'm speaking from Canada. Canada, which has the highest population of Ukrainians outside Ukraine, has been, of course, training those very groups. Not widely recognized in Canada, but undoubtedly is the case.
Thanks for those comments, Mervyn. It matches a lot of what we've discussed. And maybe Will can grab from the YouTube channel that we've had a couple presentations previous, like last spring, and going over some of what was happening there, because for us, we could see this new Cold War and this issue with NATO and how dangerous it was. So So yeah, we will put in the chat some other resources for folks who want to understand that more, because absolutely this is a piece of what's happening. So thank you. And there is another hand up, and I think we have time for one more question. We are getting late here, but Michael, go ahead and unmute. There you go.
Okay, I just had three things I wanted to comment on really quickly. As far as NATO and Ukraine, there were joint exercises a few months ago, and a lot of Ukraine's already integrated into NATO command and control, even though they're not NATO. So that's one thing to remember, is that they're de facto NATO, even though they're not NATO in some ways. I wanted to also mention about the Mujahideen in the 70s and 80s. That was co-funded by Saudi Arabia. That was one of our joint war efforts that the Saudis were doing. And strangely enough, they would use the Muslim Brotherhood guy, very religious people, to fight communism. And so that was one of the things that kind of turned into a blowback when it came to the Osama bin Laden issue. And the third thing is, to my understanding, reading William Blum's Killing Hope, the first CIA coup was not in Iran in 1953, but it was the Italian election of 1948. And then possibly even a coup in Syria in 1949. And that the coup in Iran was actually a British coup the US put a lot of money into, but it was like a joint operation between the British and the US to overthrow Mossadegh.
Thank you for that information too, Michael. Proxy wars is another thing on our list that we would like to try to have someone speak on. Another topic that is complicated and can be confusing. So we're going to look for someone who can speak really reliably about that. All right.
Respond to Chris's question there real quick before we end, just that the Cost of War Institute doesn't try to measure the costs of U.S. proxy wars. They do talk about them when they are authorized under the post 9/11 authorizations for use of military force. So they're part of the numbers if they were covered under the AUMFs. So some of those proxy wars will be in the figures I shared, and some of them are not. It's the way they focus it in is saying if it's authorized under the AUMF, then it's part of the work they're doing at the Cost of War Institute, and if it's not, then it's not. So it's kind of split.
Thanks, Will. And we do encourage folks to check out the Cost of War Project, their website. They've been doing amazing work for many years, and we will eventually have Stephanie or one of her co-workers on. But meanwhile, that is open to you to go and check out and learn more. So we want to thank you very much for coming. Really glad to have this conversation today, and we'd love for you to stay in touch with New Hampshire Peace Action. nhpeaceaction.org is our website, and you can look up there some of what's coming up next in our conversation series. The next one, I believe, is the Forgiveness Project. Yeah. So we're going to have Dave from the Durham Community Church coming to talk with us about an installation that they are hosting for at the moment called The F Word. It's about the Forgiveness Project. Let's call it a radical reconciliation project, something that is deeply needed all over the world. Very important work. We hope you can come and check that out with us. And there's a lot more coming up. So I'll just say that one for now. But again, nhpeaceaction.org is the place to go to learn more. This series is free and open to everyone, but if you are able to contribute at this time to our work, that is very, very much appreciated. nhpeaceaction.org/donate.